Well, hello everyone. Welcome to CSAC's weekly research seminar. I'm Harold Trinkunas. I'm the Deputy Director here at CSAC. My pleasure to welcome you, both here in the room and online. Um, Today we'll be hearing from one of our pre-doctoral fellows, Ian Reynolds. Ian is a candidate at a PhD candidate at American University's School of International Service. His research interests focus on the intersection of science, politics, digital technologies, and international security. He's going to be talking to us about his dissertation today, um, uh, um, which I understand he has just submitted.
Yes.
Yes. So
Mere weeks
congratulations.
Thank you.
And he is previously at American, been associated as a doctoral fellow at the Internet Governance Lab and at the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology. So without much further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Ian. There'll be a chance for Q&A at the end of the session. One finger to get on the queue, two fingers to jump in, to jump the queue, to comment on a matter immediately at hand. And if you're online, please enter your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom.
Awesome. Thank you, Harold. And as mentioned, my name is Ian Reynolds, and I would just like to thank everybody before getting started for attending my talk today. So this project is oriented around explaining the increasing momentum of integrating artificial intelligence into command decision-making processes in the United States, which is, at least in part, set to delegate aspects of command and control decision-making away from their traditional human spaces. And they argue that to understand this momentum, we need to look to the grounds on which such AI-enabled technologies are justified and legitimated. And to do so, I suggest that we need to assess shifts in ideas about how members of the US defense community think about the relationship between the themes of speed and knowledge and the relationship and links to war and command since the end of World War II. In essence, I argue that changes in this intellectual environment have provided the enabling grounds for justifying the integration of these technologies in the face of competing cultural traditions that might suggest that these trends would be quite controversial. So why is unpacking this important, right? Why is diving into these enabling conditions for integrating AI into command important at all? I think it's uncontroversial to say that artificial intelligence and advanced computing are becoming increasingly integrated into the processes and practices of war. Of course, ongoing debates over the legitimacy or legality of things like lethal autonomous weapon systems, but states continue to pursue these technologies. Moreover, they continue to pursue AI-enabled decision support systems, which are set to delegate elements of these decision-making processes away from the traditional human spaces. So I think one example of this is these two headlines on screen indicate is the war in Ukraine. For example, the CEO of the technology company Palantir has recently claimed that the Ukrainian forces are actually using their software for targeting decision-making. As the second headline here indicates, the war in Ukraine is also bringing autonomous weapon systems to the front lines. And whether, it remains contested whether these weapon systems are acting with lethal autonomous force. At the current juncture, it would likely require simply a software update in order to do so. And one just very recent thing that happened last week was Palantir released this demo on YouTube of their LLM, large language model, enabled command and intelligence software. So if anybody wants to see how people are maybe envisioning how AI-enabled command might work, you can quite easily find this on YouTube. Maybe make your decisions on what you think about that within the context of this presentation. The United States is very much in on the military AI and machine learning game. So I'll just point to some high marking points here. Perhaps most well known is what is known as Project Maven, which is the DoD's efforts to analyze sort of reams of drone footage with machine learning algorithms. Recently this year, the Department of Defense released their updated policy on autonomy in weapon systems, known as Directive 3000.09. It does not ban the development of lethal autonomous weapon systems, as some have maybe suggested, but does instead subject them to a process of senior review before being deployed operationally. And perhaps most related to the talk today is what's called Joint All-Domain Command and Control, which, among many other things that are included in this Joint All-Domain Command and Control bundle, are efforts to transform command through the efforts of integrating artificial intelligence and machine learning into decision-making processes. So these trends have led many international security experts to assert that decisions are set to be delegated away from their human spaces. For example, according to Horowitz and Greenberg, the increasing integration of artificial intelligence into security ecosystems has the potential to reduce the degree of human agency involved in making and assessing decisions in the international security domain. Johnson comes to similar conclusions, suggesting that the line between the handoff from humans to machines will become increasingly blurred. However, these trends or this momentum challenges and butts up against what we might call this romantic tradition of thinking about war and the linked theme of the heroic or archetypical commander. I should mention that romanticism is not a totally ossified intellectual tradition, and it touches on far more things than just the domain of war. But emerging in the context of 18th and 19th century Prussia was a pushback against Enlightenment thoughts about war as something that could be predictable or something that could be subject to universal laws. One perhaps visual example of this is what's known as the Vauban Fortress, and I guess the quality is a little degraded there up here. But as you can see, it's sort of an expression of war in geometrical and precise terms. But the romantic pushback to this saw war not rooted in something that could be universal or expressed in geometric fashions, but more the domain of morale, experience, initiative, will, and human ingenuity. And this remains prominent in more current discussions about war. As just one short example, John Boyd, who is perhaps most famous for being the originator of the observe, orient, decide, act loop, argued that machines don't wage war, people do, and they use their minds. As I mentioned, this sort of links to this notion of the heroic or archetypical commander. Military historian Cathal Nolan has discussed this in his work, The Allure of Battle, or this notion of sort of an ideal of leadership, or of the great captains whose genius can see things that the normal person's mind cannot. In this sense, battle is sort of a canvas for which this commander can operate and conduct their genius. And Nolan has argued that this vision has, and I'm quoting here, intoxicated generations of generals. And these are just superficial examples, right? But what they point to is sort of this tension worth unpacking a little bit farther between this kind of war as romance or war as science. And I'm certainly not the first person who's noticed this distinction. As early as 1961, Morris Janowitz, who is a sociologist of the military, argued that the history of the modern military establishment could be described as this struggle between sort of this notion of the heroic leader who embodies traditionalism and glory versus military managers who are more interested in the scientific or rational conduct of war. If you're wondering if this still applies today, this recent article that was published in War on the Rocks characterized debates over using large language models for military planning as Colonel Luddite versus Major Turing. So of course, referring to the anti-technology movement of the Luddites and famous computer scientist Alan Turing. But what this does is sort of underscore this puzzle, right? How can we explain this ongoing momentum behind integrating artificial intelligence into command decision processes, which is sort of set to delegate elements of decision making away from this archetypical human genius in the face of these prominent clashing cultural traditions? So just to refresh my argument, I suggest that in the context of after World War II, developments in shared notions related to the themes of knowledge and speed and military thought and their links to war have provided a sort of rhetorical platform for justifying the integration of artificial intelligence into command decision. The goal of the project then is to track shifts in these themes and illustrate a sort of stabilization of the socio-technical configuration which provides these enabling cultural resources. I then want to look to how these shared visions of war are rhetorically deployed in debates over the integration of artificial intelligence into military command in the US. And I suggest that contextualizing these shifts and then illustrating their deployment in action can help us sort of resolve this cultural puzzle. I'm certainly not the first person to discuss the intersection of artificial intelligence and international security. Scholars, for example, have started to look at how artificial intelligence might implicate or shift the balance of power, kick off new security dilemmas, or initiate new arms races. Scholars operating from a more critical or post-structural approach have delineated and underscored how these technologies can be productive of new types of security and power relations in the context of things such as targeted strikes, policing, border control, and war. And then still others have looked and focused more on this nexus of AI and decision making to understand why people may or may not defer to automated systems. What do elites think about the use of artificial intelligence in the context of crisis decision making? Or what the integration of artificial intelligence might mean for decision-making frameworks such as the OODA loop. And these are certainly very important contributions and build out our understanding of artificial intelligence and how it might intersect with international security. But as I'm sure many of us in here are familiar with, part of our job as scholars is delineating why these other approaches don't necessarily answer our own question. So I'll dig into that just briefly here. I suggest that these traditional security studies frameworks, such as balance of power or security dilemmas, might suggest why global structures or new technologies might incentivize states to adopt or develop new technologies and sort of general structural factors. But what they don't do and what they're light on is case-specific sequences and processes that underscore how this sort of integration of new technologies were legitimized and justified in the first place. Organizational approaches frequently touch on things such as organizational culture, but what they do is commonly bracket culture and technology into their own analytical boxes as sort of analytical constructs. And what this is difficult in terms of my project is I'm quite interested in processes of boundary contestation. What do technologies mean to cultures? So if we treat them as sort of analytical priors, then it becomes quite difficult to analyze these processes of contestation. In the constructivist literature, we might call this the reification problem. Post-structural accounts are quite comfortable integrating technologies and the social processes, but more uncomfortable in delineating any specific mechanism or notion of even a relaxed form of causality. And I think important in this type of project is addressing this notion of technology as a silver bullet. Right? If the technological performance is just so fantastic that its legitimacy would be inherent in its performance. And I think there's some reasons to be a little wary of this at this point. For example, even at the cutting edge, large language models are known to replicate biases in their underlying data sets. If anyone's played around with it, it's probably hallucinated the existence of authors or citations that don't exist, or provided incorrect but plausible responses to user queries. This is even to mention sort of the broader ethical or regulatory issues behind using these large data sets. This isn't to say that technological performance isn't impressive, right? But I think there's still good reason to have sort of a critical eye on these technologies. So what do I offer, right? I think we need to dig here a little bit into social theory. And what I do is offer a draw on relational sociology and science and technology studies to offer a configurational theory of change. This is riddled with jargon, so let me try and break through some of that. Many theories of the world, at least in international politics, tend to start with actors as givens. You could think of sort of states, international organizations, some agent that goes around and does things. It's even embedded into how we talk about international politics, right? Russia did X, China did Y, NATO responded with. In this sense, the things come first. They're preformed, and the relations between them only second. But in very broad terms, someone interested in this relational approach might start from a different place. In this sense, relations and transactions, or in my case, language, set the conditions for action, identity, or entity formation to even happen in the first place. So a relational scholar might be interested in the stabilization of practices or agents. And these stabilizations are things to be explained in themselves. So, someone operating with this sort of approach might be interested in the types of relations that make speaking about something like the state, the sovereign state, or national interest even possible in the first place. And as others has done, I'll call these stabilizations configurations. I think this comports well with many of the teachings of science and technology studies. For example, Bruno Latour, who many of you have probably heard of, explicitly calls for relationalist ontology. In this sense, technologies are embedded within social processes, not external to them, and clearly distinguishing where kind of the social ends and the technological begins becomes difficult. And these are sort of theoretical connections that I bring to my own work. This all sounds super chaotic and complex though, right? How is dissolving the world into sets of kind of ephemeral relations helpful at all in explaining or understanding the world? And this is why I focus on two specific themes, knowledge and speed. And I treat these as analytical constructs. You could think of it a bit like a Weberian ideal type, right? It's not supposed to mirror reality, but it helps us break through and understand these complexities of social reality. So then to explain this outcome of interest, I suggest that we need to map these constraining and enabling resources. It illustrates how things and practices come into being. So I've been kind of toying around with this analogy of a spice market, right? There's a bunch of spices in the market, but just their existence doesn't dictate the exact meal that anyone is able to cook. There's agency within that context. In this sense, what's available in the spice market might be the boundaries of available resources, and it structures that agency. So in the context of my project, the idea is to map these ideational themes of speed and knowledge. Look for the development of stabilized scripts or recipes about how these themes link to war and command, and how they're enacted in specific debates over the technology. And to do this mapping, I use a combination of computational textual analysis, which will feature just a little bit in the talk today, and more conventional document analysis of discourse based on doctrine, military journals, technical documents, and other similar sources. So if we want to think about this here in a very simplified sequence, the enabling conditions are sort of what's going on in the spice market. The deployment will be the process of cooking the meal, and the outcome is then these sort of changes in processes and practices that I'm interested in. So as I mentioned, my work focuses on the themes of speed and knowledge. But for today's purposes, I'll just focus on the theme of knowledge to not bore you all too much. So what do I mean by knowledge, right? What I mean here is knowing what to do in war, right? How to make sense of unfolding events. How does the commander make decisions? As the scholar of military history and command and control, Anthony King, has argued, the traditional role of the commander has been to, quote, illuminate the darkness for their soldiers. So, what are the processes and practices for doing this? And then the goal is then to illustrate this progressive linking amongst members of the US defense community that AI could be the path towards clearer, more certain war, even if it meant taking humans out of the decision-making processes. And what I map here is the emergence and linking of three sub-themes. These include, first, new ways of knowing; second, the increase in informational anxieties; and third, the construction of knowledge and information as possibly decisive elements of war. So how might we indicate that change is even ongoing at all? I think a way to do this is through the use of computational textual analysis methods. It helps us provide a degree of scale in our analysis of cultural patterns or linguistic changes. So what I've done here is constructed a data set of 1,600 issues of military journals since the year 1950. If anyone cares how many words there are in that, it's about 36 million. So what I suggest is that these methods help me track disjunctures and stabilizations in the themes and technologies I'm interested in. So just show a couple graphs here. One question I'm interested in is general technological salience. Are people even discussing artificial intelligence at a higher rate than before? So what this chart does here, and the dotted line, sorry for people in the back, is the use in the data set of terms related to artificial intelligence. This includes AI, machine learning, and autonomous weapons. And I compare it with the solid line, which is another important military technology of ballistic missiles. And I think what this tells us is a pretty significant and stark rise and mentions in this data set of military journals of technologies related to AI. So it definitely seems like the technology du jour, right? A second chart here tracks a dictionary of terms associated with the theme of knowledge. I won't get into too many specifics over what dictionary methods are or what terms are included within this dictionary. And I'm happy to answer that in Q&A. But what we see in the table here is a notable increase in the usage of words related to this theme of knowledge around the turn of the century. And these are very crude representations, right? But they do show some initial evidence that something interesting might be going on that we might want to dig into a little bit farther. But they don't tell us anything sort of about the character of these debates. And for that, I think we need to do a more in-depth document analysis. And what I find is the emergence and stabilization of this tripartite family of ideas related to knowledge and its relationship to war and command. And as I mentioned, these include new ways of knowing, anxieties over data and information overload, and the notion that information itself could be possibly decisive in war. So I'll start with the top here and kind of summarize working down. What I mean by new ways of knowing are the emergence of systems of sensing and perception after the Second World War. These include more advanced radar systems or satellites, and links to desires to make war a more scientific or something that could be subject to processes of quantification. Think here about operations research or systems analysis. And these developments occurred within the context of, as strategist Bernard Brodie put in 1949, a military profession that inevitably required, quote, a subordination of rational to romantic values. So you see here this sort of clash of cultural elements is coming together. The second track here are emergent anxieties over data and information overload. In many ways, these anxieties were created in part by the new sensors and drive towards quantification. So as someone who's interested in more STS approaches, we see sort of this co-production going on. But this also happens within the context of a shift from what was known as the industrial era to the information era after the Cold War, in which centralized or linear organizations needed to adapt. This also meant the traditionally centralized organization of command and control needed to adapt as well. Some worried that commanders might have volumes of information, but no coherent image of what their operation was at hand. David Alberts, who was a member of the Command and Control Research Program at the DoD, I think put this well in the year 2000 when he argued, quote, that the information era was a time when our analysis methods are becoming less and less able to shed light on the choices we face. It is a time when the tried and true approaches to military command and control, organization, and doctrine need to be re-examined. And finally, this last element that I trace is the construction of information and knowledge as possibly decisive elements in war. In this sense, war was becoming less about material factors, more about knowledge and information. And we see this in the integration of information and knowledge-related components into military doctrine during the 1990s and into the 2000s. For example, the first US information-specific doctrine, US Army information-specific doctrine, was released in 1996, excuse me, very important distinction. And the doctrine argued that information and knowledge that flows from it, quote, empowers soldiers and their leaders. When transformed into capabilities, information is the currency of victory. And we see similar developments in other services. Moreover, we see a rise in concepts such as information superiority or decision advantage and decision dominance, which as one Air Force journal put it in 2021, quote, in a data-dependent and data-saturated world, victory belongs to the side with decision superiority. These concepts are now integrated into current military doctrines, such as the Army's multi-domain operations. And what I think we see here is a sort of self-supporting relative stability in the links between the themes of knowledge and war. And these emerge in the post-World War II intellectual environment. But just the existence of this configuration doesn't predetermine an outcome. And that's why I suggest we need to look at two snapshots about how these sorts of visions of war are enacted in debates over specific changes in policies. What we'll look at today are two programs. One is embedded in the changing context of knowledge and war. It's known as the Strategic Computing Initiative. And here we see contestation over the role of knowledge and its links to AI. The second perhaps represents a more stabilized version of this configuration, and it's known as Joint All-Domain Command and Control. So for those who aren't aware, strategic computing was a DARPA-run program that started officially in the year 1983. And it was focused on paths towards integrating artificial intelligence into the military. DARPA was set to help develop a co-pilot for the Air Force, an autonomous vehicle for the Army, and perhaps most relevant to my talk today was an AI-enabled naval battle management system for the Navy. And I think what this program represents is sort of a good marking point how AI was justified in terms of its relationship to knowledge and the contestation over the technology's ability to make military decision-making more clear. So proponents of the program linked this notion of AI-enabled battle management systems to more clarity in war and decision-making. For example, the founding document of the program, which was released in 1983, argued that, quote, the system must alert the decision maker to the existence of an incipient problem. It must generate potential responses to the problem in the form of decision options. And it must evaluate these options in the face of uncertainty about the outcome. DARPA director at the time, Robert Cooper, in congressional testimony about the program, argued that such systems would, quote, simulate and predict the consequences of various courses of action, Moreover, they would help in the enormous information flow that characterized the battlefields of the future. So these are just some initial examples of deployments of this kind of emergent configuration that I've been talking about, including, for example, the expressions that there was this need to deal with the increasing amount of information overload, and that artificial intelligence and AI-enabled tools could be the path towards cutting through this complexity. However, we see this view as contested, right? And just one example of this comes from a group of researchers known as the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, some of which had actually worked on DARPA projects on their own. And they argued in the pages of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that if the uncertainty of battle is so serious, and if computer systems are so unreliable, why should the computing plan propose computer technology as a solution? What we see here is sort of contestation over the bounds of knowledge, what it might mean for war, and how AI may or may not help in these contexts. What we also see is the deployment of some of these emergent rhetorical commonplaces that rhyme with a little bit of what we see today. But a more stabilized configuration was not yet in form. What I think we need to look to for that is what's known as joint all-domain command and control, which I've mentioned this before, but just to refresh, is the DoD's ongoing efforts to, at least in part, integrate artificial intelligence and machine learning into command decision-making. Here, the Army is working on what's known as Project Convergence, the Air Force on an advanced battle management system, and the Navy on Project Overmatch. And I think that we see this program as made possible, at least in part, by the stabilization of the knowledge configuration that I've been talking about. And to draw on the analogy that I made before, now we've perhaps got the right spices in the market to cook this outcome. But the program is justified and rests on particular deployments. For example, in 2022, Joint All-Domain Command and Control was kind of given its own declassified strategy and implementation plan. In fact, the strategy rests on the three pillars of sense, make sense, and act, and is envisioned as sort of, AI and machine learning as providing the pathway towards, quote, information and decision advantages. Officials who are working as part of what is known as the Joint All-Domain Command and Control cross-functional team have suggested that, quote, the AI algorithms will provide will enable all domain situational awareness. Moreover, they will provide information dominance. Finally, those working on Joint All-Domain Command and Control have argued that this project will provide information and decision advantages. These are, of course, only concepts that make sense and emerge from the configurational context that we've mapped out and discussed here. So now I'll maybe offer some conclusions and some provocations to set the table for discussion. So just to rehash my argument, I suggest that justifications for artificial intelligence into the domain of commanded decision-making in the United States are based on this emergent and shared understanding of war and its links to the themes of knowledge and speed. I've, of course, only touched on one element of that today. And they emerge from processes of contestation over the boundaries of successful war and the role of the commander within those conceptions of successful war. Strategic computing and joint all-domain command and control are just two examples of these visions of war debated and put into action in the context of rhetoric. And I should suggest here that I'm not really making an argument about the elimination of the human element, right? What I am suggesting is that we now see a redrawing of boundaries that make possible new forms of war and the application of violence. And it's sort of a tracing that illustrates the commander's role as reconstituted within a new rhetorical and technological configuration. And sort of one thing as I've been wrapping up the dissertation, and maybe this is more on the provocation side and can set the table for our discussion in the Q&A, is agency within these AI-enabled systems. I think human control is frequently talked about in the context of being in the loop or on the loop, right? And this sort of sovereign ability to say, no, it's not time to use the AI system, right? But what I think these types of systems challenge us to do is think about decisions as process outputs. They're not necessarily binary events where someone has the ability to say yes or no, right? In the context of AI-enabled decision-making, these decisions will be structured by and emerge from elements of system design. They'll emerge from the training data that we use or the decisions in computational architecture that designers use. So just to say that a human who's operating a system has this sort of sovereign decision-making position might be sort of pushing our eyes away from these more complex socio-technical processes that command decision making will now be a part of. And then just finally, I think in a technology that's so hype-ridden as AI, we need to always have in the back of our mind the need to avoid any sort of, as John Lindsay calls, technological theory of victory. That AI might be the solution to a more fogless or advantageously fast war. If you kind of look back at the history of military technology, these technologies are frequently built into sort of notions of decisive or fast war. So I think we should, as we further develop these technologies, consider the risks of any sort of technological solutionism. And with that sort of note, I will be quiet and look forward to all of your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a great talk, Ian. As per the usual CSAC practice, we'll take the first question or two from our CSAC fellows in the room. If you are online, please remember to answer your questions, to ask your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. So let's start with Rhiannon and Julie, and then if anybody else wants to get on the queue, please raise your hand.
Hi, I'm Rhiannon Nielsen. I'm Cybersecurity Postdoctoral Fellow here. Ian, great talk. That was super interesting. I have a question that kind of pertains to something you touched on in the last slide, but you talked a lot about how there's this narrative of like the heroic commanders and radical ownership over decision-making practices, and this quote that you said, information is the currency of victory. And conceivably, that's because it better informs decision-making practices pertaining to war. And this might be a little bit trite, but are you worried about military leaders kind of getting into deliberations with ChatGPT about whether to launch particular missiles, or, you know, the sort of back and forth to there, and to what extent they'd be outsourcing a lot of these deliberations or agency to AI?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Thank you.
And I mean, if you go and check out that Palantir demo, they're literally going back and forth with a large language model on like, this is the, please generate 3 courses of action, you know, disrupt this tank that we've found. Of course, in none of that demo does the enemy have any agency at all. So perhaps if you watch it, look at that. But I mean, I think one thing we need to think about is that information and more information, especially within the context of these systems, does not necessarily mean more clarity. There's a really interesting article in International Security by John Lindsay and someone with the last name Goldfarb. Sorry, I'm not remembering his first name, but they basically suggest that, you know, there's this idea that information can bring clarity, or these systems can bring clarity, but they can just as easily shift the fault of war back on to commanders. What we see in historical debates, and part of a talk like this is you kind of have to eliminate some of the things you're going to talk about. But there are serious debates over if these technologies will provide clarity, or on the other hand, will they provide basically paralysis, right? We have so much information now. We have so much ability for this heroic commander, right, to get into the nitty gritty and to kind of micromanage. So while they might be promises of reducing the fog of war, what we might actually get is stagnation and over-centralization. So yeah, thank you.
Julie George next, and then we'll go to Paula Edwards online.
Thanks, Ian, for your great talk. I really learned a ton, and it's nice to see overlapped findings from both of our dissertations when it comes to AI.
Always good to see that, right?
Yeah. I'm wondering if themes of speed and knowledge are limited to artificial intelligence, and if this expands to other technologies like cyber or nuclear weapons. I bring up cyber because the term agility is often brought up as, you know, having, you know, this relative capability to make faster decisions and to get data more quickly. So I'm wondering if you think that these themes can be brought out to other technologies, or if you think this is more specific to artificial intelligence.
No, I think they certainly can, but perhaps not in the same way. We see this all the time with like hypersonic weapons, right? We need to act faster, or like you mentioned in the cyber domain. And sort of part of the maybe I'll touch on the speed element now because you've given me the chance. is both this rise of weapon systems that are acting faster, but then that sort of causes this notion of cognitive constraints. Now we need to decide faster because these weapon systems, war is more mobile. We have ballistic missiles that can reach us from the Soviet Union now. So we need to think faster. So I absolutely think these can apply in different contexts, but I think what we need to be careful is just saying, you know, speed or knowledge are the same across all contexts and all situations. And this is kind of why I treat it as that analytical construct, right? It's not like a mirror to reality or anything, but it helps us sort of explain how these are justified and legitimated. But yeah, absolutely, I think they apply, but that could perhaps be its own dissertation. Thanks.
So I'll integrate a question from Paul Edwards and then go to Naomi and Scott. So Paul says, large language models are essentially text predictors, autocorrect on steroids. They don't know anything. They don't reason in the human sense. When you question their reasoning, they usually revise it, and they can reach opposite conclusions if challenged in a series of prompts. They don't have any embodied sense of the world, so they make mistakes when they are asked to do things that demand embodied experience. On the other hand, robots and autonomous vehicles are developing embodied knowledge, although he stresses that he puts this in scare quotes.
Yeah.
Do you see any awareness of these issues in the literature you've reviewed? How do you think embodied perception, such as that of robots and autonomous vehicles, will change military understanding of AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, I guess I think I'll start with the first notion of like these large language models as what they're known as stochastic parrots or whatever, and I think that's basically a good framework for thinking about these things still. Right? They basically are just data munging all the probabilities of the text that's on the internet and spitting out what reflects that. But in terms of robots, I guess I'm not so familiar with this notion of embodied experience in robots, or maybe I would push back on that a little bit. I mean, they're still, from my knowledge of how robots are programmed, still taking in data in the same way, and they're still doing sort of similar things. But I mean, I certainly think in terms of military applications, robots are today being used for data collection and surveillance. If you go, as mentioned, you know, maybe these drones aren't acting autonomously right now, but they're certainly collecting a lot of information. If you've been following any of the like open source intelligence, you could see tons of drone footage of. So I think that's probably the military application for robots, at least in the near future. Whether we decide to have them fire guns or not, to still be determined. But that's something that I will think about more, Paul. Sorry, I don't have a great answer to your question, but thank you very much.
Go, Naomi.
Hi, I'm Naomi Eagle. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSEC. Thanks so much, Ian. This is a great presentation. I want to follow up on this idea you put forth about the emergence and stabilization of these three ideas related to war.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you sort of how integrated or dependent on each other they are, and especially what you mentioned first with the desire to make war more scientific, and third, the view that the information can be decisive in war. And so for example, is this desire to make war more scientific based on a theory of victory that information is decisive in war, or are these sort of separate? And just to pile on one more thing here, you know, sort of what I'm struck by is that we can talk about this as a desire to make war more scientific, but it's a very particular kind of science, right?
Yeah.
And so in these debates and in this contestation that you've looked at, how much are other ideas about how science can be beneficial for the military integrated, or is this really the dominant view of what science is for the military?
Yeah, no, that's really good questions. So in the first one, I think they are not necessarily bounded together, but it took rhetorical work to bind them together in this specific way. So we see, as I mentioned, sort of this contestation that these information systems or more information could actually not provide more knowledge, right? There's not a necessary link between those two things. But kind of what we see in a lot of military doctrine is that they are linked together. So that's not predetermined, but it sort of stabilizes and bounds itself together, and is now, as I at least try and show, is sort of what these new conceptions or ideas of using artificial intelligence in the context command command and control sort of rest on. But your second question about notions of science in the military, this is a super interesting intellectual history on its own, in terms of, science as linear science, right, or Newtonian science versus nonlinear sciences. And this is a huge debate, especially emerging and slowly, perhaps since the 50s to present day, of nonlinear war or nonlinear effects. And I think what's taken as the work of Antoine Bosquet and Sean Lawson has shown is that these nonlinear metaphors for science and war, and their integration, specifically with modes of quantification, has perhaps become the most dominant. But nonlinearity, I should say, doesn't necessarily mean quantification. John Boyd, who I've brought up a couple times today, was definitely a nonlinearist, but he challenged notions of farther integrating these hyper-technological systems into command and control because he thought they would slow down decision making. He thought that they would basically make people too rigid, so it would sort of mask the more natural factors of war. So in that sense, he's drawing on scientific metaphors, but a very different type of science. So yeah, thanks.
Scott?
Scott Sagan, co-director here at CSAC, and political science professor. I want to follow up on Julie George's good question by asking you to say more about what's similar and what's different between this revolution that you're talking about now and the nuclear revolution. Tom Schelling, you'll recall, famously argued that nuclear weapons are not the first time that we could have destroyed an entire civilization, saying that we could have killed every Japanese civilian in 1945 if we had just kept conventionally bombing or firebombing. But the difference is that the speed by which nuclear weapons could destroy makes a difference. And then he also wrote a lot about preemption, which again requires knowledge and speed, and about pre-delegation. Pre-delegation of authority is like machine learning, but it's outside of the central decision maker. It's just making another human, a military commander, make the decision, not the president or prime minister, etc. So can you compare the ideas that are going on here with the same or similar, or maybe they are different ideas from the early nuclear age literature?
Yeah, so maybe what I'll start answering that question with is sort of this embeddedness of speed as more successful war or more advantageous war, which I think is sort of something that can be challenged on its own grounds, right? You could certainly outrun yourself, either outrun your sort of political decision-making apparatuses or outrun your strategic planning. So I'm not so sure that the link between speed and successful war, and I'm not saying that Schilling was saying this, is inherent, right? But in terms of nuclear weapons, I mean, part of this emergence of this worry about speed, which is the part I didn't talk about, is this worry about ballistic missiles and the way that they will constrain decision-making efforts. But what I don't think this does is necessarily link to this notion that faster decision-making is better in war or more advantageous in sort of a tactical or operational sense. And that linking comes out again of this John Boyd fellow who is, I didn't want to get into Boyd too much when I was writing this, but then all of a sudden I realized that he's like, oh my God, like central to everything that's going on here. So I think these, what I would say, these links were not predetermined, right? That people had to sort of collect this constellation of ideas together. But part of sort of the driving force here, and maybe shows this sort of co-constitution between the technological elements and the social elements, were ballistic weapons, were nuclear weapons, and these emergent worries that, oh God, now we have to act faster. Now we have to find ways to delegate to machines that are quicker than humans. Whether they are or aren't, that's maybe a different social history, but those were certainly the anxieties that people were pointing to. Thanks.
Go to Cameron in the back, and then we'll go to Rod, and then I'll take an online question from Trond, and then I think you're in the queue as well.
Cameron Tracy, research scholar at CSAC. Thanks for the great talk. So one of the themes kind of throughout this is the trustworthiness of knowledge that stems from these AI, algorithmic, machine learning, whatever processes. In other modes of knowledge production and the role of knowledge in military decision-making processes, you have gradients between true and false. So the thing I'm thinking of mainly is a technology, which isn't usually seen as a technology because it's not as a machine, but in the intelligence community, there's this system of confidence ratings given to essentially any judgment that's made, which political decision makers obviously see as useful and necessary to do their jobs. You often don't, I think, see similar use of gradation in confidence in, for example, the product of a large language model, which simply tells you things authoritatively, regardless of the confidence embedded in that, which is a little strange because they are actually uniquely amenable to giving confidence ratings when there are baked into this process probabilities that certain series of words will be associated with certain series of words you use in your prompt. I just wonder whether in your study of the discourses around this, you have seen discussion of trustworthiness or confidence in the outputs of AI-enabled technologies as part of a gradation, or simply as the computer is telling me the truth or the computer is lying.
It's, yeah, really, really good question. I would say less the computer is telling me the truth versus the computer is lying. I mean, there's some of that, right? But what I see mostly is this recognition and desire for trustworthiness. And of course, I have no access to classified information. They could be having these deliberations. But part of sort of that policy on autonomy in weapon systems that I pointed to is just the sort of language you're talking about. Like, we need trustworthy AI. We need reliable AI. We need to use the right data sets. But the back end of that remains unclear to me, if that makes sense. Sort of like there's this knowledge of, oh, we need to do this, but no real pathway or mechanism, at least from an external point of view. There could be many, I'm sure there are deliberations going on. But I've seen less in terms of that like gradation of confidence intervals, but more of this knowledge and association that, wow, we really do need trustworthy AI, but maybe we're not sure quite how to get there yet. And I would say even on the cutting edge, we're probably not quite sure how to get there yet, right? I can go on to ChatGPT right now and ask it something, and it'll probably be pretty unreliable. So yeah, thank you.
Let's go to Rod next.
Okay, Rod Ewing, co-director here at CSAC and a professor of earth science. So I'm out of my depth. In this discussion, what's missing for me is, prior to AI, how were military decisions made, particularly in battle?
Yeah.
So is there some general theory or understanding of how humans fight wars?
Yeah.
And is it clear that for decision making in this context, speed and knowledge are positives, not negatives? How does that work?
Yeah, so I'll answer your first question first, which is, yes, there's a lot of work on command sort of before the era of artificial intelligence or computing more generally.
The difference is, I'm not asking if they work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And typically, I think they would come in the form of a more centralized commander, right? He might be receiving information, but it would be in the form of notes or telegraphs. But they're commonly, it's commonly less this broader socio-technical system and more so one chief commander who's kind of given unity of command to make decisions.
Right, but I think if you look at U.S. command structure and battle front, it's not one commander, but it's a delegation of authority.
Yeah.
With the whole chain of command having an understanding of what decisions they might make, be allowed to make, they should make. So that's the type.
So just to understand, you mean that this would vary in distinguishable or meaningful ways from the processes that I'm trying to outline here?
Well, in the sense of, and just take your words, having a central commander, that concept may not apply. That may not be actually the way it works.
And maybe if I could just tag on for I think this is not just a temporal issue, it's like a cross-national issue. So for example, if you think about, reporting on the Russian or Chinese militaries, there's typically much less delegation of authority down to lower levels of command.
Yeah.
There's less trust in,
I
whereas
understand
the
now.
debate in the United States, if you go back just 20 years to like the Iraq War, there was the whole notion of the strategic corporal,
Yeah.
right? Like even a corporal sort of the next to lowest level in the enlisted ranks needed to have a sense of what was going on in the conflict because they could have an impact on the outcome, and
Yeah.
they should be empowered to act in ways that were positive. Is that sort of what you're getting at, Rod?
That captures it. Maybe a even stranger analogy would be to think about the neural system of an octopus. An octopus is pretty intelligent, but you wouldn't mimic that intelligence by having a central brain. An octopus is distributed the decision making throughout the organism. So
Yeah.
it's very important to know exactly if you're worried about AI, exactly the structure of the neural system that you're replacing.
And I'll even push that a little bit further. And sorry for abusing the chair's prerogative. But I think this is interesting because some of the debates you see on AI are about whether, for example, in authoritarian systems, because authoritarian systems don't trust their own people, AI becomes more attractive as a way of achieving greater predictability in, let's say, your military or security structures. And so that becomes even more attractive for them as opposed to, let's say, the contrast with the US experience, which found in sort of counterinsurgency that you had to go the entirely different way. You had to decentralize way down to small units because they could have an impact on your counterinsurgency efforts.
Yeah.
And this debate goes back to Vietnam as well. This is not an Iraq.
Well, even, I mean, so I'll answer by saying this debate over centralization versus decentralization is very old in command and control literature, right? Even the Prussians were talking about the need to decentralize. So this isn't sort of new, right? And of course, John Boyd's whole thing was about we need to decentralize command decision making because at the edges, people are more adaptive. They have more ability to perceive what's going on the ground rather than this sort of figure at the top. So this centralization versus decentralization debate is something I'm plugging into. Maybe I don't have a great response to your first question, and sorry if I'm not understanding it right.
Better question was
Yeah.
Harold's rephrasing.
Well, that was about the applicability of in international terms.
Yeah,
correct.
no, there's two things going on. One is that there's different philosophies for how you operate
Absolutely,
the military
yeah.
and how much you delegate command, but there's also that could also be related to political systems.
Yeah.
And settings where you might actually find that there's, like, if you did the same study on Russian discussion of command and control, a lot of, I mean, there was even, I recall this ability sort of, it was very attractive to the Soviet system to have like a cybernetic command where like the central commander could actually see all the way out to the individual units to maximize that centralization. So I'm just pointing out that that there's some, it's not just a temporal element, there's like a cross.
Oh, for sure.
Strategic cultures element to it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the wrong way of phrasing it.
No, I think you're right. And I should say this is, I'm only looking to the United States here, but from what I know about what China and Russia are doing, it's far more centralized. And whether it works better or worse, I don't know, TBD. But on this notion of maybe it being more advantageous or that more authoritarian government would look to these technologies as sort of advantageous. There's this really interesting article in Foreign Affairs I brought this up actually last week at dinner when Robbie Shilliam was here, by Farrell and Newman in Foreign Affairs. This notion that we kind of think that China has this data advantage, right? Because they don't really care about privacy and they can suck up all the data out there. But what they don't really have built in is any sort of feedback mechanisms. Artificial intelligence systems are all based on feedback mechanisms, right? That's how you correct for performance. So this notion that China might have data advantages, well, if they've broken all their feedback mechanisms, then maybe they might see this as sort of advantageous in the way that you pointed out, but it could in fact be the opposite. So hopefully I've kind of touched on some of the themes there. There's a lot there, but yeah, of course.
Okay, let me squeeze in one more question here and maybe one in the back of the room.
Yeah, Artem Kravka from Kyiv Polytechnical Institute. Actually, I'm from Ukraine. Thank you for your great speech. It's a big pleasure that these advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning now used to fight these battles, and it's great. But I have two big concerns. First of all, how do you think is this data for training is reliable? That is using for LLMs, and the second, in the case when we are using, I mean, military will use this artificial intelligence. What's about responsibility? So yeah, we have talked already, but how do you think who will take responsibility for these decisions of their results? Yeah, so please, thank you,
Yes.
Ryan.
Thank you so much for that question, or both of those questions. They're very relevant. And one thing that really worries me is data reliability. Even in the context of training a large language model that isn't in war, which we know is complex, which we know is unpredictable, they still perform in unpredictable ways. So now add in that war is unpredictable and someone is trying to deceive you, and you're in a bit of a perhaps problematic scenario. There was, I think the article is from a year ago, but it was about the US military using what is known as synthetic data, or basically computer-generated data to train artificial intelligence systems. And I believe it was something like the system thought it was right 90% of the time, but was actually only right 25% of the time. So imagine giving that sort of technological performance to soldiers on the front line. Not so good. So maybe there's some issues that need to be resolved there in terms of data quality. Actually, there almost certainly are. And then a responsibility. Yeah, that's a huge, huge, huge question. And I'm probably not going to be able to answer it in a fantastic way today. But this is sort of why I was getting at the end, this notion that perhaps agencies shouldn't just be seen as this human on top of this sort of sovereign OODA loop. You know, there's responsibility built in throughout this. There's responsibility in how we build our data sets and the system designs that we enact. So we might have to, I don't know, calibrate our notion of what responsibility means in these new computational architectures.
But it's very quickly, because we have
just
one more question.
comment. Probably this technology could be used as the assistant, as every soldier will know all this complete information that is just not possible to gather on the battlefield. And I suppose this is the biggest value for the soldier, so he can process this information even quicker. Yeah, and of course for the command as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, and last question in the back.
Thank you. Just one quick comment and one question that forgive my phrasing for, but it strikes me, you know, the thing that we're hearing most about ChatGPT and things like that is how it can pass the bar exam. And it strikes me that, like, perhaps, and this goes to your point about different military structural philosophies, maybe the place for these things is more in the little lawyer sitting on a soldier's shoulder saying, don't target that or don't do something, rather than strategic, you know, surveillance and targeting and command decisions. I wonder if at this point there are more practical uses that you're seeing people talk about. And then related to that, kind of a question about, are there any declassified, unclassified, non-classified case studies relating to the human-computer interaction element of this? And I think a commercial example would be like the 737 MAX, where you have this hyper-intelligent system that the pilots are untrained with and they don't trust, or they're getting different information coming to them, different knowledge from some different system, and they are now fighting with the intelligent system, leading to disastrous results. And so just...
Yeah, second one first. I would look to the work of Missy Cummings here. She has a lot of work on kind of this human-computer interaction and sort of why people may or may not defer to automated systems. And she's definitely sort of operating in that military AI literature. And your first point about unreliability and sort of will it be the lawyer on the shoulder, that's an interesting idea. I hadn't really thought of that. But I mean, one use that I think is like perfectly legitimate is logistics, or like when we need to repair something. Like that's hard stuff to track too. So I'm not saying that there are no uses of this, but perhaps on the edges it becomes a little more unreliable, a little more foggy. So thanks very much for your questions.
Unfortunately, we're out at time, and we still have more questions. I will make sure to share those with you, Ian. So if you want to follow up with some of our folks online. But thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.